It was said that no one left Whitlock House unchanged. Those who dared to enter spoke of an oppressive presence, one that gnawed at the soul and stirred up emotions no living thing could invoke. The house had a history stretching back over a century, and with it came the legends, stories of unexplainable tragedies, disappearances, and a haunting so malevolent that even the most seasoned paranormal investigators refused to return. For years, Whitlock House sat abandoned on the outskirts of the small town of Hallowell. It loomed at the end of a long, winding road, its Gothic architecture casting shadows that stretched unnaturally far as the sun set behind it. Passers-by would quicken their pace near the property, feeling a chill that had little to do with the cool evening air. Children told stories of the ghosts that resided within, of the whispers that escaped through the broken windows on windless nights. Yet, as with all such places, there were always those who believed they could conquer the fear, who thought the stories were nothing more than local folklore. And that's where our story begins, with four friends who thought they were brave enough, skeptical enough, to spend a night inside Whitlock House. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Sam, Jamie, Claire and Tom had been friends since childhood. They'd grown up together, sharing secrets, dreams, and everything in between. Now in their late 20s, they were no strangers to thrill-seeking adventures. From urban exploration to camping in the wilderness, they'd always had a taste for adrenaline. So when Claire, the most skeptical of the group, suggested they spend the night in Whitlock House for Halloween, the others couldn't resist the challenge. "I'm telling you," Claire said with a grin, "it's all just a bunch of stories to keep kids from breaking in. People get freaked out, their imaginations run wild, and they start seeing things that aren't there. We'll prove it's all nonsense." Tom, always up for a good scare, leaned in. "I don't know, Claire. People say the house is cursed. Maybe there's a reason no one stays in there long. What if we're just walking into a trap? Or maybe we'll have a great story to tell," Jamie added with a playful smirk. "Besides, it'll be fun. We'll take some pictures, maybe record some spooky sounds. You know, the usual." Sam, the quietest of the group, nodded but remained hesitant. He wasn't as convinced as the others that Whitlock House was just another abandoned building. He'd heard the stories, seen the looks on people's faces when they talked about the house, and something deep inside him felt uneasy. But peer pressure is a powerful thing, and within a week, the four of them had packed up their gear, flashlights, cameras, and sleeping bags, and set out for the infamous house on Halloween night. Chapter 2. The Arrival. The drive to Whitlock House was unsettling. The closer they got, the more isolated the surroundings became. The trees grew taller, their branches tangled like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The road narrowed, twisting through the forest as the daylight faded into a murky twilight. When they finally reached the iron gates of Whitlock House, the atmosphere was stifling. The house itself seemed to stare back at them, its dark windows like hollow eyes in a skull. The grounds were overgrown, the grass nearly waist-high in some places, and the wind had an eerie way of rustling through the dead leaves without actually touching them. "Does anyone else feel like this place is watching us?" Jamie asked, half joking as they stepped out of the car. "Nope," Claire said, trying to keep her voice light. "Just your imagination." But even she couldn't deny the feeling of being watched as they pushed through the creaking gates and made their way up the cracked stone path to the front door. The air was thick with anticipation, and something darker, something that tugged at the edges of their minds. The front door was surprisingly easy to open, as though it had been waiting for them. The smell of dampness and rot hit them immediately, but beneath that was something else, something metallic and old, like blood long dried but never forgotten. Sam hesitated at the threshold, his hand gripping the doorframe. "Are we sure about this?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire rolled her eyes. We're already here. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We get scared, we leave. No big deal. With that, she stepped inside, the others following close behind. The interior of Whitlock House was just as dilapidated as the outside. The walls were peeling, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the furniture was covered in thick layers of dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air felt stale, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. They set up their sleeping bags in what had once been the grand foyer. It was a vast, open space with a massive chandelier hanging precariously from the ceiling. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its steps worn from years of use. Despite the eerie atmosphere, they laughed and joked, trying to shake off the unease that clung to them like a second skin. As night fell, they explored the house room by room, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. There was an old library with crumbling books, a dining room with a long, dust-covered table, and a parlor where an ancient, out-of-tune piano stood in the corner. The deeper they went into the house, the more oppressive the air became, but none of them wanted to be the first to admit they were feeling it. Then, as they entered the basement, things began to change. The basement was cold, far colder than the rest of the house, and the air felt heavier. The stairs creaked ominously as they descended, the light from their flashlights bouncing off the stone walls. A faint, distant sound echoed through the darkness, like the drip of water or the soft shuffle of footsteps. "Did anyone hear that?" Sam asked, his voice tight. "Probably just the pipes," Claire said dismissively, though her grip on her flashlight had tightened. But the sound persisted, growing louder with every step they took. It was no longer just the drip of water. It was something more, something wet and deliberate. It was the sound of something moving in the dark. "Maybe we should go back upstairs," Jamie suggested, her bravado faltering. "Yeah," Tom agreed quickly. "This place is giving me the creeps." As they turned to leave, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging them into darkness. The sound of the door reverberated through the walls, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. Panic set in immediately. Sam raced up the stairs, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," he shouted, his voice laced with fear. Claire joined him, pulling at the handle with all her strength, but it was as though the door had been welded shut. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, her skepticism beginning to crack. Then, from the shadows behind them came a low, guttural whisper. It was a voice, but not one that belonged to anything human. It was old, cold, and filled with malice. "Get out!" The words slithered through the air, curling around them like invisible fingers. It sent a shiver down their spines, their hearts pounding in their chests. Jamie let out a terrified scream, backing into Tom as they both stumbled toward the center of the basement. "What was that?" she cried, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Tom whispered, his face pale, "but we need to get out of here." They huddled together, their flashlights flickering as the air grew colder still. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, pressing in on them from all sides. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The basement fell into an eerie silence, broken only by their ragged breathing. For a moment, they stood frozen in place, too afraid to move. That's when they noticed the writing on the walls. The walls, once bare stone, were now covered in words, hundreds, thousands of words, scrawled in a dark, wet substance that glistened in the dim light of their flashlights. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as though written in a frantic rush, and the words themselves were chilling. "Leave, you're not welcome." "She's waiting." "What the hell?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "It wasn't here before," Sam said, his heart racing. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The words seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as though the house itself was trying to communicate with them. Then, Just as suddenly as the writing had appeared, a loud creak echoed through the basement, drawing their attention to a small hidden door at the far end of the room. It was ajar now, revealing a dark passageway beyond. "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "No way. We're not going in there." But the whispering began again, this time louder, more insistent. The words seemed to claw at their minds, pulling them toward the door against their will. "Do we have a choice?" Jamie asked, her voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." Reluctantly, they approached the door. As they stepped through, the passageway narrowed, the walls closing in on them like the grip of a giant hand. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the sound of dripping water grew louder with each step they took. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the bowels of the house, until finally they emerged into a small, circular room. At the center of the room was an old, rusted iron bed frame, and lying on the bed was something none of them were prepared to see. It was a body, long decayed, its flesh shriveled and blackened with time. The clothes were tattered, barely clinging to the skeletal remains, but it wasn't the body that made them recoil in horror. It was the face, or rather, the lack of one. The skull was smooth, featureless, with no eyes, no mouth, nothing to indicate that it had ever been human. And yet, as they stared at it, they felt a presence, something dark and ancient that filled the room with a suffocating dread. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut, trapping them inside. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of death. The whispering returned, louder now, filling their minds with screams of agony and terror. "She's here!" the voice hissed, sending a wave of cold terror through their veins. The temperature in the room plummeted further, their breath now visible in the frigid air. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive and aware of their presence. Their flashlights flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Then, in the far corner of the room, something stirred. A dark figure, barely distinguishable from the surrounding shadows, rose slowly. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly thin and elongated. The entity moved with a grace that was unnatural, almost fluid, as if it wasn't bound by the laws of the physical world. It stepped into the dim light, revealing a face that sent a fresh wave of terror through the group. Its skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow all light, and its mouth was an endless void that stretched too wide, too deep. The figure opened its mouth, and the whispering grew deafening, a cacophony of voices, pleading, crying, cursing. They filled the room, overlapping in a chorus of madness, pulling at the edges of the friends' sanity. "Run!" Sam screamed, pulling at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The others joined him, their hands frantically trying to force it open, but it was as though the house itself had locked them in. The entity moved closer, its eyes fixed on them with a predatory hunger. Its limbs twitched unnaturally as it floated above the ground, the sound of its approach like the dragging of dead leaves across stone. And then it reached for them. In that moment, the lights on their flashlights gave out completely, plunging them into darkness. The darkness was absolute, thick, choking, and alive with the relentless whispers that now echoed in their minds. Sam's heart pounded so loudly he could hear nothing else. It felt as though the darkness had weight, pressing against him, suffocating him. He groped for his friends, his hands trembling in the pitch black. "Jamie!" he called out desperately. "Claire? Tom?" There was no response. Only the cold touch of the unseen entity closing in, the air thick with a presence that was too terrible to comprehend. Then through the darkness, a voice pierced the silence, Jamie's, trembling and barely audible. "I'm here," she whispered. "Sam, where are you?" Sam followed her voice, stumbling through the suffocating blackness until he felt her cold hand. Relief surged through him as they clung to each other, their bodies pressed together as though they could shield one another from the growing terror around them. But the moment of safety was short-lived. The whispers rose again, louder and more insistent. It was as if 1,000 voices were speaking all at once, their words melding into a discordant symphony of suffering. "Claire!" Tom's voice broke through the din, filled with panic. "Claire, where are you?" "Tom, I'm here!" Claire's voice, frantic now, came from somewhere to their left. But before she could say anything more, a terrible wet sound filled the room, like the tearing of flesh, the crunch of bone. Claire screamed, a sound of such pure terror that it cut through all else, turning Sam's blood to ice. "Claire!" Jamie shrieked, pulling free of Sam and running blindly through the darkness toward her friend's voice. "Jamie, wait!" Sam tried to grab her, but she was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. He could hear her calling out for Claire, her voice growing more desperate with every step. But there was no answer, only that horrible wet sound, closer now, as if something was feeding in the dark. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sounds stopped. The air became deathly still. Sam stood frozen, his breath shallow and quick, listening for any sign of his friends. Silence. Utter, oppressive silence. "Jamie," he whispered, afraid of what might answer. A low, guttural moan echoed from somewhere far too close, followed by the faint sound of dragging footsteps. Sam's skin crawled as he realized that something was still in the room with him, something that had been lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. He backed up, his hand fumbling in his pocket for his phone. His fingers trembled as he activated the screen, casting a weak blue glow into the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see what lay before him. Jamie's body. She was sprawled on the ground, her eyes wide and staring, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Her face was pale, her skin cold to the touch. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and glistening in the faint light. Sam's stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands shaking violently. "No, no, no, no." He could barely choke out the words as tears welled in his eyes. But before he could even begin to comprehend what had happened, there was a soft creak behind him. He turned slowly, the light from his phone sweeping across the room. In the far corner, he saw it. The entity. It was hunched over, its long skeletal fingers dripping with blood, its hollow eyes fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. Sam scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for any of this. All he knew was that he had to get out of there, now. He bolted for the door, his shoes slipping in the blood that had pooled across the floor. His fingers fumbled with the handle, pulling with all his strength. The door groaned, resisting him for a moment before finally swinging open with a deafening screech. Without looking back, Sam rushed up the narrow stairs, the sound of the entity's dragging footsteps following close behind him. The house seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in, the air growing colder with each step he took. By the time he reached the first floor, he was drenched in sweat, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He stumbled into the foyer, gasping for air, the weight of the house bearing down on him like a physical force. "Tom!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Tom, where are you?" There was no response, only the sound of the house creaking and groaning as though it were alive. Sam glanced around wildly, his eyes searching for any sign of his last remaining friend. But the house was empty, its shadows deeper and darker than ever before. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. Tom. He was standing at the base of the grand staircase, his back to Sam. His posture was rigid, his head tilted slightly to the side, as though listening to something only he could hear. "Tom," Sam breathed, relief flooding his chest. "Thank God. We have to get out of here. Jamie, Claire, they're gone. We can't stay." But as he approached, he realized something was wrong. Tom wasn't moving. His body was unnaturally still, his head at an awkward angle. Sam's relief turned to dread as he reached out to touch his friend's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Tom's body crumpled to the floor like a rag doll, revealing the jagged, unnatural break in his neck. His face was twisted in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. Sam stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He felt a scream rising in his chest, but before he could release it, the house began to shake. The floorboards groaned under the weight of something massive moving beneath them. The walls shuddered, dust raining down from the ceiling as the entire house seemed to come alive. The whispers were louder now, deafening, as though the house itself was screaming. Sam staggered, trying to keep his balance as the ground beneath him trembled. He could feel it, something ancient and powerful, stirring deep within the house, something that had been waiting for this moment. Then, from the shadows, a voice emerged. Not the whispers that had haunted them, but a single, clear voice. It was soft, almost gentle, but filled with a deep, abiding sadness. "You shouldn't have come here." Sam turned, his eyes searching the darkened foyer, and there, standing at the foot of the staircase, was a woman. She was dressed in a flowing white gown, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and filled with an otherworldly glow. Her hair floated around her head as though suspended in water, and her presence filled the room with an oppressive cold. She was beautiful and terrifying all at once, and Sam knew without a doubt that this was the entity that had haunted Whitlock House for so many years. "Why?" Sam's voice shook as he spoke. "Why are you doing this?" The woman's gaze softened, her expression sorrowful. "I was once like you," she said, her voice echoing with a sadness that seemed to span centuries. "I was drawn here by curiosity, by pride. But the house, it is not just a house, it is a prison, a vessel for something far older, far darker than you could ever imagine." She stepped closer, her form flickering in and out of existence like a dying flame. "I was trapped here, just as you are now. And over time it consumed me, twisted me into something else, something monstrous." Sam took a step back, his heart pounding. "But you can help me, right? There has to be a way out." The woman shook her head slowly. "There is no escape, not for me, not for any of us. The house feeds on our souls, on our fear. It will not let you leave." The realization hit Sam like a punch to the gut. He felt the weight of it settle over him, cold and suffocating. There was no way out, no escape. Whitlock House was alive and it was hungry. But even as despair clawed at him, something inside Sam refused to give up. He wasn't ready to die, not like this. There had to be a way. There had to be something he could do. "What if I burn it?" he asked, his voice trembling but determined. "What if I destroy the house?" The woman's eyes widened, a flicker of hope lighting her ghostly features. The fire. It could sever the connection. It could destroy the house's hold on us. Sam nodded, adrenaline surging through his veins. He didn't have much time. The house was already closing in, the walls seeming to breathe with malevolent intent. He had to act fast. Racing through the foyer, Sam searched for anything flammable. Old drapes, tattered furniture, anything that would burn. He piled it all in the center of the room, his hands shaking as he worked. Then, using the matches he kept in his pocket, he lit the pile, watching as the flames quickly caught and spread. The fire roared to life, its heat searing the air. The walls trembled, the house letting out a terrible, ear-piercing wail that reverberated through Sam's bones. The woman stood beside him, her form flickering more rapidly now, as though she were being pulled away by the fire's power. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. "Perhaps now we can finally rest." And with that, she was gone. vanished into the ether as the house began to collapse around Sam. He ran, the fire spreading faster than he could have anticipated. The walls buckled, the ceiling caving in as he sprinted toward the front door. Flames licked at his heels, the heat singeing his skin as he threw himself out onto the front lawn, just as the house behind him was consumed by fire. Sam lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion and shock. He stared up at the night sky, the stars blurred by the tears that filled his eyes. It was over. He had survived. But as he lay there, the wind howling through the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The whispers. They had stopped, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. And then, from the smoldering ruins of Whitlock House, he heard it, the faintest of whispers, carried on the wind. "You'll never leave." The ground beneath him trembled ever so slightly, and Sam knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had only just begun to understand the true horrors of Whitlock House. Months passed, and Whitlock House became nothing more than a hushed rumor in the town of Greywater. The charred remains were eventually cleared, and for a time it seemed as though the terrible events of that night had been buried along with the house's ashes. But as the town grew and new homes were built on the land where the house once stood, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered in the homes, objects moved on their own. Children spoke of a woman in white who watched them from the corners of their rooms. And at night, when the wind blew just right, the townspeople would hear the faintest of whispers drifting through the air. Whitlock House was gone, but whatever had lived within it, whatever had fed on the souls of those trapped inside, had survived. It was only a matter of time before it found new victims.